All right. Um, I'm sure folks will still continue to trickle in, but if we're um, ready to go, I will kind of go ahead and share my screen and do a little introduction here. So thanks to everybody who's joined so far. This session is being recorded, so uh, just to FYI. And give me a sec and I'll get my slides up. All right. And unless I hear otherwise, I assume folks can see my screen. And I will carry on. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network, kind of our monthly information session. This month is on food sovereignty and security in Alaska. And a little bit before about what the AKTRLN is, what we kind of refer to ourselves as, based out of the University of Fairbanks and Alaska Pacific University is where I currently reside by, and not too far actually, as just down the road. Our Tribal Resilience Learning Network consists of Melinda, Jolene, myself, and Lori as the Tribal Climate Resilience Liaisons. And then with the university staff, we have Krista, Mike, Laverne, Ryan, with actually USGS, Jeremy, and Nathan. So how do you participate if you're not already within our learning network? You can sign up and join and have us available for one-on-one check-in calls, providing technical assistance on a wide variety of topics. We do have a e-bulletin that goes out and that contains information not only on what our staff and what we are up to month to month, but also kind of events that we're going to be at, events that would be relevant to your community. And obviously these learning network information sessions that cover a wide variety of topics, everything from coastal erosion, relocation, and to this month's topic of food security. We also have the Relocation Managed Retreat Protect in Place cohort training, which is also very helpful. And our website is down below. Part of my position as a Tribal Climate Resilience Liaison, I also work with the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. And here's some of our more up-to-date events coming up. Of immediate occurrence is our national conference, which is next week, May 4th through the 8th. Little short-term notice there. But we do have a beaver workshop in Kotzebue, and that's June 2nd through the 4th. We also are accepting applications for Alaska Summer Youth Practicum, and those applications are open till May 11th. And that program runs July 6th through the 13th. And last but not least, our Alaska Regional Conference, tentative dates right now are August 31st through September 4th. And tentatively, we are looking to host that regional conference in Southeast Alaska. With that, I'm going to introduce here our presenters and keep it short because I want to give them the time to share what they're going to talk about today. So today we have Tikon Galbraith with the Mentasta tribe, currently wears a hat as the Chief Operating Officer for First Alaskans Institute, but comes with a very deep experience and wealth of knowledge on food security in Alaska. And following Tikon's presentation, we'll have Henry Huntington with the Ocean Conservancy. And last slide kind of lists our positions here and the website, where you can also find the recording of this webinar. And with that, I will pass it on. to Ticon. Stop sharing.
Hi, everyone. Great to see so many people on today. My name is Ticon Galbraith. As Christy shared, I am a tribal member of Mentasta Traditional Council, a shareholder of Otna Regional Corporation. Grew up in Fairbanks, between Fairbanks and Mentasta. Currently residing in Anchorage. Been here since 2011 on Dena'ina lands. I am employed by First Alaskans as the Chief Operating Officer, but prior to working for First Alaskans, I worked at an organization called Intertribal Agriculture Council, a nationwide membership nonprofit supporting food sovereignty and food security for tribes across the nation. And I also, just sharing some of the hats that I wear, I am the Vice Chair for Alaska Food Policy Council, and currently serve on the Native Movement Governing Board as well. So today I am going to talk about navigating modern landscapes with traditional plants. When thinking about food security, we can't ignore our traditional foods. And I've spent a lot of time educating and sharing about our plants as food and medicine. Just some more background, I co-founded the Anchorage Food Mosaic, which is a community group focused on healthy food systems for all Alaskans, and we're building community one bite at a time. And through that work, I got connected with the Alaska Plants as Food and Medicine Symposium, and worked on the leadership committee with Margaret Hoffman David and Mita DeWitt and Gary Ferguson to put on the conference for the next 7 years, working to build a bridge between our traditional foods as medicine and our traditional healers and the Western practice of medicine on the ANMC campus. From that lens, through that work, I wanted to talk to you all today. But first, I really wanted to start with a visualization. So if you'll entertain me at your desk in your own space, if you want to close your eyes, if you feel comfortable, or just a soft gaze, I want you all to picture your home, your house, your home, where you reside at night. Really picture that detail, and then picture a farm. And then can you picture wild game moving across the landscape, visualizing the return of the fish in the fall? Can you picture last year's harvest? Did you fill your freezer? Is your pantry full? And with all those visualizations in your brain, I want to ask you the question of, when you pictured your home, did it include people? When you pictured the farm, did it include people? What about the wild game or the return of the fish? And I start today with that because each are familiar to us, right? But each, as we visualize it in our brain, will look a little different. And where did that image come from? It's from the experiences we had, the stories we've read and seen. So through my work, I really truly believe that Alaska is uniquely positioned to not only imagine what is next, but to also ask the question, how do we want to get there? And I want to remind us that our individual actions every day to provide for our families, to fill our freezers, to create community, and ultimately strengthen our food system is what supports a healthy food system for Alaska. Our organizational missions, our visions guide how we get there. And it is how we are going to get there that I continue to find myself ruminating on. Like, what steps are needed to really achieve that healthy food system? And I come back to the farm and the landscapes that we've inherited. And my question that I continually ask is, how do these two blend? How are they divergent? I think about the scale, the size, the animals, the function, community versus individual versus family. How do they all intersect? How can they mutually support? In working with the Alaska Plants as Food and Medicine, we asked this question of what are the themes and how do we continue to protect and support our Alaska plants and to allow us to continue to have access for that food and medicine function. As I said, our goal with that conference was to raise awareness and demonstrate the value of Alaska Native foods and their influence on the state of Alaska, the historical politics that go along with it, and the importance of them and including them in the resilient future. One year I had an opportunity to lead a keynote on the values that guide us and how we are responsible for perpetuating and also cultivating the values that we want to live by, that guide us each day, that support us. And from that keynote, we went into a workshop. And from that workshop, these are the themes that came out from that conversation. Folks wanted to see sovereignty of and holistic action, respect, stewardship, sustainability, preservation, to be guided by these values, to support education and knowledge cultivation and protection of these plants. So a big part of the way that I've engaged with our food system is through wild harvesting, berries, plants, roots. I dry nettles each spring. I harvest birch sap. I put up my own food. I go hunting. I fish. And through that action, I have, learned some and gained some values that I've adopted for myself. So when we ask why wild harvesting, what I've learned is that wild harvesting includes an inherent invitation to slow down and to be present and engage with Mother Earth. I know firsthand on harvest days, and when my narrative includes statements like, I can't wait until we have 5 gallons of blueberries or 10 pounds of morels, I am frequently disappointed by the end of the day. And that reminds me that if we forget to breathe and be present instead of being goal focused, it's easy to overlook the plant that we're seeking out. I step over the morels that are right there on the side of the trail as I first start. It's important, I think about this, and it really came true for me when I was going to the store for milk. My wife was like, "Oh, we need milk," and she was baking something, and so I jumped in the car and I drove to the store and I got that gallon of milk, and I got home and I was here to the milk, and my wife was like, "Oh, thank you. Did anything happen?" And I thought about it, and I couldn't think of anything but the milk. My mind's eye was on that goal of getting to the milk, of grabbing the milk and getting back with that milk for the activity, the baking. And, I failed to see the cars on the road, the people walking down the street. I failed to see the budding leaves. I missed all of it because my mind's eye was already projected on the goal. So when we wild harvest, we're not only cultivating relationships with the plants, we're also being brought into the present and being invited to slow down. So with plants, my grandmother always told me that plants present themselves to us and offer their medicine when we need it. And, I found that this can mean eating with the seasons, such as eating spruce tips and nettles in the spring to help flush the body with winter buildup of starches and proteins. It can also mean that when a plant speaks to you and reveals itself for the first time, it's probably time to learn about that plant and how to integrate it into your diet. And when I say that, I mean, like when you're walking down a path and suddenly there's it's almost like a spotlight is on it, that tree or that plant. You're like, what is that? What is that plant? Why is it standing out to me? That's the plant saying, meet me, learn me, speaking to you. Another truth that I've been told is that when plants go unused, or plant communities, they'll move on or may disappear entirely. And so when I asked you to visualize the landscape, to visualize the farm, it's intention. It was intentional because I believe and I've been taught that there is an importance to maintain the continued use and engagement with plants to support the retention of not only their presence, but to cultivate our traditional knowledge that has been shared with us by elders. It also creates the opportunity to expand the traditional ecological knowledge and allow it to evolve alongside the expansion of awareness that is occurring in our world and continues to be more interconnected. right? We have access to the interwebs. AI is on the cusp of incredible things and scary things. But these are truths that are now in our awareness and tools that we can use to expand our traditional ecological knowledge, to further our values, to reimagine how we're engaging with the world. And that is that culture is a living thing and it continues to evolve. So I encourage us to think that we must perpetuate our cultures by identifying and practicing the elements that align with our individual and community values around food and plants. So the benefit of wild harvesting is grand and great, and there are multiple. Sometimes wild harvesting can look like a leisurely stroll through the forest or meadow. Other times it can mean navigating a burn area with downed trees or steep mountains or an unforgiving cliff. Any way about it, it is beneficial for our physical activity to get out and move and be on the land. When I think about nutrition, I think about agricultural approaches to cultivation and the historical emphasis on yield and yield sustainability, yield per unit, resource applied. But when we think about wild plants, they coexist with their environment, which includes a constant evolution of the genome. As the environment evolves, so does the plant. And as a result, the nutrition of wild foods has been shown to, in multiple studies, to on average have a much higher amount of phytonutrients, vitamins, proteins, fiber, and minerals. And so when conversations surrounding food available in the supermarket, you often hear like cheap or fast, easy, expiration dates, on sale, and the quality of food is often missed. The health or poisonous aspects of the food are completely overlooked. And thinking about that, I see that the food ideology is pushed on American culture by corporations. They're looking to make a profit with no consideration for the long-term health consequences or the negative habits that ensue. And this is the opposite of what I've been taught and shown through our traditional foods. Food is a way of living, food is culture, food is medicine. So when we wild harvest, it can help to reduce the need to purchase items from the store, which can save money for our households. Many plants are only available when wild harvesting, and they also have a potential for entering in the global market, such as chaga or wild blueberries, salmon, or morels. We all see those as specialty items, fetching a high price on their individual units. And with the internet now available, there's the opportunity to use it and engage with the global market to sell these products unique to each of our regions. That said, we all know that the best berry picking spot will always be shrouded in mystery, but many of our practices are community events. For example, tree sap in the spring or salmon in the summer, berries in the late fall, or hunting. Even the best berry spots can help build community since they're often shared within the family, right? Handed down through generations. So as I reflect on this intersection, as we do as a community, I think it's really important to recognize that the interests of humanity require a very careful consideration with our relationship with the larger environmental context. Especially during challenging time, we must take care to protect these things, and that they are our life source, and they give us sustenance, they sustain us, they support us. And so as an act, it occurs one at a time. Berry picking reminds us to slow down or things get missed. Berries hidden below the leaves. And so as my berry bucket slowly fills, I wonder, what does it mean to preserve? Is it to persevere, to continue on or overcome? Or maybe it is to outlast. Maybe it's the act of preserving what we hold on to. Something is saved. An act, a value, culture, memories. So can you picture a time in your life when a person walked into your room and before you even see them, you feel their energy? Maybe they had just fought with someone or upset or happy and joyous, which you are able to see once you see them, but you had to turn to see them because you had felt them, right? I think we've all felt that. And I consider this whenever I walk into the wood. We have to walk into the woods with the intention of harvesting. What is my energy? Does it align with the movement of the forest? Animals and plants have their own ways of knowing and can sense the respect when it is present in the actions of an individual. Respect of a plant manifests in many ways. It means walking slower to ensure that your footsteps are doing no harm. It means not harvesting a plant that is just starting to establish itself. It means knowing a plant before harvesting and using all of the plant, so there is no waste. In my life, offering gratitude and sharing thanks has ranged from setting my intention and showing respect to the plant to verbally saying thank you or offering a song or prayer of appreciation. It's providing a gift back to the plant. So I ask you all, what does the act of wild harvesting mean to you? Why do it? And I invite you to take time to create in your life space to consider these questions. Your answers can help guide your intention when you hold that intention while wild harvesting. So never take more than you need unless it's the fruit of a plant. So thinking about the fruit of the plant in Alaska, that includes berries and mushrooms, right? And harvesting those fruits help to spread the seed and often does little harm to the plant itself. But when I think about ethics, I ask myself one question, what are we doing to ensure the plant and plant communities' survival and their resilience? I think about the things that are bigger than just my own action, say harvesting from the plant. We often hear say a third, as it's written on this slide here. But if I go in and harvest a third and somebody without a keen eye goes in to the same spot and finds that same plant and they don't see that I've harvested, they will take a third and then a third and then a third. And we still run risk of harming the plant without intention. So respect the protocols of the land that you are on. And so, make sure that you ask for permission to use, that it's legal. Alaska is a patchwork of land. There's state, federal, municipal, tribal, and private land. Know the land that you're going on. And then be aware of your environment that you're harvesting from. And don't harvest near roads or trails. People are recreating on the trails, and you should not be harvesting right off the trail. Railways spray for weeds. They put pollution into the ground. Know how the land has been treated and be thoughtful of that. And so when I think about the diversity of Alaska's food system, I think about the incredible amount of work that is happening. And I do just want to plug the Intertribal Agriculture Council. There's the Alaska region, and they're doing incredible work to support individual tribal producers and all the work and goals, overcoming the obstacles and navigating the USDA. And so I think the question is, how do we educate and share knowledge while also ensuring that we are paying respect for the plants and protecting them from future generation? Respect goes beyond having admiration for the beauty or function of the plant. It also encompasses learning about the plant's needs and growing plant patterns, so learning it well.
Just call me. She said she's up.
And when I think about that, I really, in my own wild harvesting journey, I recognize that if we all went out and harvested from the land, there wouldn't be enough to provide for the large community that now calls Alaska home. There's over 750,000 of us. I think that's the current number, right? So personally, I have taken to cultivating the plants and medicine in my backyard for the availability. And so as we think about site designs, as we think about village relocations, as we think about building new buildings, I encourage you all to look at our traditional Alaska Native plants and integrate them into the site design. So our traditional ways of knowing have always served us in the past and led us to survival, and they have allowed us to be gathered here today. In recent times, change has come more rapidly than before. The landscape that we now survey is foreign in many ways. The language is different, the weather is different, the world is different, but the way we see remains the same. We know the world has changed because we see the world through our traditional values. If we want food security for ourselves and for our people, we must continue to embrace who we are and to remind each other of our traditional ways. We care for one another, we hunt for those in need, we pick more berries than we can eat so that we can give them away. We take pause and truly see what is in front of us at the moment and understand how we fit into the landscape. And then with a gentle hand, we help guide the rhythm of all of that towards abundance. Embracing our traditional approach to survival can remind us that we survey the land and evaluate what is out there and can support our continued success and health. And through our collaborative and intentional approach, we can establish a strong foundation for Alaska that is informed by our values for the next generation. So I see the Alaska food system needs more people generally, but again and again, I see Alaskans who invest both time and money into ensuring their house is full of local food. I get inspired by all of the Alaska foods, harvesting from the land, buying food produced in Alaska, and sharing meals with a friend or family. And I've learned that when there's intention connected to the action, there's almost always a ripple effect. So the oral histories of Alaska Native people inform us that the land has sustained them for 10,000 years. In multiple accounts, such as journals and scholarly articles, early colonizers claimed through observation that the land was uninhabited and incredibly abundant. And I would argue that their limited mental models prevented them from seeing that the abundance was the direct result of the stewardship of Alaska Native and American Indian people. So when we think about, again, that visualization at the beginning, the people were and are a part of all of those landscapes. And from the values of our tribes and our regional corporations and our traditional ways of knowing have come from that relationship with the land. So when we think about values, I want them to be person and community centered, culturally relevant, place-based, seasonally aligned, holistic and inclusive, adaptive, and spiritually connected to purpose, place, and connection to creation. Our community creates support networks, traditional education, and mediation between the challenges that we are undoubtedly going to face. Repeat.
This meeting is being recorded.
And so I think there's great opportunity in Alaska, and we're seeing an incredible increase of Alaskan-made products, and I think there's only greater opportunity. And I'm recognizing the time that I've gone slow here, so I want to wrap it up. But these are some questions that I want to leave you all with as you consider your way to engage with the Alaska's food system. I want to thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Tikon. Definitely. Yeah, appreciate your mentioning beginning of your presentation, going out for milk constantly. I find myself in the parking lots of Fred Meyer thinking, I need to stop and think what's going on around me. So, and definitely going into the forest, into the rivers with intention and no ill feeling is definitely something I can relate to. So thank you. And as we transition, if anybody has questions for Tikon, I'd ask you to hold those until we're done with our other presenter. Henry, are you ready? I will pass it on to you.
There we go. Sorry, just trying to juggle all the buttons here and make sure I get the right ones.
No worries.
Is that showing up?
Yes, I can see it. It looks good.
Great, thanks. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you to the Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network for giving me the chance to talk about this. I'll be talking about a project that was led by the native village of Kotzebue. You can see all of the co-authors on there. It also included myself and my wife, who's a veterinary pathologist who does a lot of work with wildlife, and Tula Holman, who's another wildlife veterinarian, as well as several people who are very much embedded in the traditional food production system of hunting and processing and storing and preparing and everything else. I really appreciated Tikhon's presentation. It's a tough act to follow because mine will be a lot more prosaic than his beautiful words. But one of the things that he mentioned, I'd like to emphasize now, and sort of the spoiler alert for our project, was that if we're concerned about food safety, and I'll get into that in a sec, the best thing we can do is sustain, support, and strengthen the traditional ways that people have always used for assessing whether foods are safe to eat. These are things that people have done for millennia, learning from the land, learning from experience, and so on. And there's no way to replace that, and there's nothing modern that can replace that. Partly because of the depth of experience, and partly because that's something that's shared and distributed among all the people who are involved in the food production systems around Alaska. If we decide instead that we need some, equivalent to the FDA, what you're really doing is concentrating the expertise in a small area, among a few people, and hoping that you can have access to them when you need it, rather than recognizing that in the traditional systems, everybody who was involved played a role, and everybody brought considerable knowledge that worked for a very long time. So our big question is, how do you know your food is safe to eat? And this is an aspect of food sovereignty and food security. Obviously, there's a lot more to both food sovereignty and food security, but if you want your food to be secure, and if you want to have sovereignty over the food production, presumably you'd also like to know that what you're getting is safe to eat. And then how do we make sure that, how do we assess that as we're going through the various stages? We had a number of conversations with men and women in Kotzebue. We did a review of literature about the various pathogens that are found in wildlife. And then we tried to compare what we'd learned from both of these, to ask, what can we learn from one another? What concerns do we share? And then what can we do together to further improve food safety? Coming on the heels of Tikhon's presentation, I don't need to repeat that traditional foods are very important for lots of different things. We also know that foods of all kinds, not just traditional foods, any food, can carry pathogens, and that those pathogens may be changing. So, again, what worked in the past is reliable in some ways, but there may be some new things coming in that we need to pay attention to as well. So we're really concerned about how people are addressing food safety now. This is not a historical project of what did they used to do in the old days, but what are people doing today? And then what works and what can be done better? And then, because it was a research project, is this a productive topic for further research and action? It will surprise no one to learn that our answer to the last question was yes. Ask a bunch of researchers if there's more research needed. Of course, they're going to say yes. But I hope that we can offer a little bit more than just a blanket encouragement to do more stuff. So, food safety, reducing the risk of foodborne and food-associated disease. Again, all the things that every time you're preparing food or eating food, you're paying attention. Has it gone bad? Is there something in there that shouldn't be? Is there something we should know about that we need to be concerned about? As I mentioned, not food security itself, but a component of it at least. And then by traditional practices, we're talking about the knowledge and skills associated with those long-standing relationships that people have, and sometimes modified with modern technology and ways of life. As I mentioned, we're concerned with what people are doing now. Nowadays, that might involve a freezer and a vacuum packer, not just the, say, traditional methods of drying or storing in an ice cellar or things like that. So we're very much interested in what people are doing here and now. So we looked at some of the traditional practices of what people do. We pay attention to the animals before harvesting and during butchering. Now, if there's something wrong, people tend to walk away. And the system is generally quite risk averse in the sense that, if there's something strange, you don't stick around, you don't try to eat it and see what happens. You just decide that you're much better off looking for something that actually looks healthy. There are lots of ways of processing and food, freezing, drying, storing in oil, cooking, etc., all of which can have an effect on some, but certainly not all pathogens, and can in some cases, resist the growth of some of them. People are also constantly inspecting their foods during all of these processes. You don't just hang it out to dry and come back a week later and put it away, but people are paying attention constantly and keeping bugs off and looking for anything growing and so on and so forth. Very, very labor intensive, and I really appreciated Tikhon's point about the amount of effort that goes into this. This is not the fast, easy food. This is something that takes a lot of time and effort and considerable knowledge. Also, paying attention to details. We all know about the cases occasionally of botulism showing up in seal oil or other things. My wife had looked at a number of videos on YouTube about how to make seal oil. Very few of them mentioned the step of stirring. And yet we heard that repeatedly in our conversations in Kotzebue, that you need to stir it while it's rendering. And this is to help make sure that it's aerobic throughout all of the seal oil. And it's often the case that something like that just seems so blindingly obvious to people that they don't mention it. And yet, it's important to remember those details, no matter how obvious they may seem to those who are used to doing this all the time. And then, of course, we examine things before we prepare meals or eat. Now, again, this is common. If you take something out of the fridge, you wonder how long it's been there. If you take a loaf of bread off the shelf, you probably look to see if any mold has grown and so on. So there are things that people have been doing all along that are important to remember. And of course, there are lots more. This is just a few examples of what goes on, but the system is much more robust than this. And there are a number of indicators that people are looking for. If animals look strange or acting oddly, that's a warning sign. If there are visible problems, if there's a wound or something going on, or they're very skinny, that can indicate a problem. When you're butchering, looking for things that are unusual in the organs or the tissues that, again, suggest that something might be going on. Not just appearance, of course, but the smell and the feel of things can be an indication. So all of these are worth paying attention to, and all of these require a considerable amount of experience. Again, etc. There are lots of things that people are doing and worth remembering. So how do these contribute to food safety? Well, you're avoiding diseased animals. You're avoiding tissues that have signs of disease. Sometimes there are things that can affect just one tissue, and you might leave that off, but the rest of the animal is safe to eat. And many of the disease agents, the pathogens, can be destroyed through storage and preparation. Not all the time, but this can happen. One example I'll give, of course, is trichinosis that can be found in polar bears. Trichinosis is a problem, but people are aware that eating raw polar bear or just frozen polar bear can be an issue. So polar bear is always cooked very thoroughly. That takes care of the trichinosis problem. So even though trichinosis is present in polar bear, the traditional practices of preparation, take that risk down to about zero. And then, of course, avoiding spoiled items. If you take something out and it's looking bad, then of course you're going to avoid eating that. And again, etc. There are lots of things that people do. This is, again, a very robust and detailed system. If we ask wildlife veterinarians about what their concerns are when it comes to disease agents in wildlife, and many of these would apply to domestic animals as well, but there are toxins, including things from harmful algal blooms, bacteria, lots of different kinds. And the point of this slide is not to go into detail, it's just to show that there are lots of things including viruses and parasites. And again, the point here is not so much the list as the fact that each of these has an et cetera. There are lots of things. So if you ask a wildlife veterinarian, you're going to get a very long answer to this question. Most of these, many of these are quite rare. Most of them are dealt with in one way or another. And so the question for us is not so much, how do we worry about 100 things at once, but how do we identify the handful of things here that actually need, deserve some of our attention? So this gets to the question of how we can learn from one another. And understanding what hunters look for and how often they see them and so on can be very helpful. That can help us communicate better to understand what we're, make sure that we're talking about the same things and know what we're looking for. We can also understand the details of food handling to assess the potential for reducing or introducing risk. I'd mentioned trichinosis in polar bears. It's not hard to imagine that a wildlife veterinarian might arrive new to the Arctic and inspect a polar bear and discover that it has trichinosis and think, oh, this is a worry. If they know nothing about what people do, they might get very concerned and start to raise this as some kind of an issue. If they're aware that people cook polar bear thoroughly, then presumably the stress level goes down and they can stop worrying about it, and we don't unnecessarily create a big whole lot of attention to something that was never an issue in the first place. It's also worth noting, veterinarians are looking at the animals in a different way and may have signs of ill health that hunters aren't necessarily looking for, but could be added to that repertoire. Again, we can learn from each other in this way and make sure that we're, talking about the same things and looking at them in compatible ways. As I mentioned, one of the big things is the risks that are going to evade traditional detection. Harmful algal blooms, you're probably all familiar with this. The problem is you can't see them, smell them, unless the animal has enough that it's displaying all kinds of neurologic signs and so on. It's not going to be obvious, and there's nothing that cooking or freezing or other preparation methods will do to get rid of these toxins. So this is now a concern. So rather than worrying about everything else on that long list I showed you, it's nice to be able to narrow down our focus to a couple things that we need to pay attention to. Now, how we go about that is, of course, a topic for another talk and for people who really understand the harmful algal blooms and those toxins. But the point is that by working together, we can figure out where the priorities are and then start to address those. And then, of course, we can learn what adjustments we can make to further reduce risk. That could be avoiding things at certain times of the year. It could be looking for additional signs, or in cases of things like HABs, it might be that we really need to figure out how to do some type of laboratory testing that is about the only way to detect if those are present in foods. Then what actions can we take? And what can we do to sustain and improve food safety? As I mentioned at the beginning, these traditional practices have kept people healthy for millennia. They're not perfect. Nothing human is perfect. People still get sick from time to time. The same is true even with our, FDA moderated system. There are recalls of foods and people getting sick. These things happen. However, if we have nothing else, those traditional practices have worked pretty darn well for a very long time. And as I said, this is expertise that can be shared and is held across the state, across communities by many, many people. And so it's a distributed system of knowing what to do and knowing how to do that. And it's hard to get more robust than that. So if we do nothing else, this is something that deserves our attention and support. Documenting traditional practices can help, and this is helpful both within the community. As I mentioned, if nobody tells you to stir the seal oil, you may not realize that that's a crucial step in doing it. So figuring out what these traditional practices entail and how to do them properly and how to make sure to convey that information is also very important. And this can help too with sharing that information with people outside the community, so that, again, people like wildlife veterinarians can better understand what's already being done to mitigate a bunch of the risks, and then can focus where attention is really needed. emerging pathogens, the harmful algal blooms, highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAI, and other things, there we need to share information about what to look for, how to avoid them, or what needs to be done. And that's an area that I think can get some more attention. And it's also important to understand traditional preferences. If people like to eat food raw or raw frozen, telling them that what they need to do is cook all their food thoroughly is not going to be very helpful. People are not going to do that. Go to a sushi restaurant and say, you should cook everything before you serve it. It's not really a sushi restaurant anymore. That's not why people are going there. So we need to find ways that take into account how people like to eat their food and how we can make that safe, rather than trying to get people to do things in a different way that is not the cultural norm and not what people like. Finally, I did mention further research. I think there's more that can be done to, do this beyond a sort of pilot effort in Kotzebue, but to look at what priority concerns are, where we can do further research, and then how to communicate effectively. And that last part is very important. Knowledge is useful. If we don't communicate it to those who need it in ways they can understand and in ways that deliver the message accurately, then it isn't doing us a whole lot of good. And so I think that's an area where more work is needed as well. With that, as they say in Kotzebue, taiku, and thank you. And the paper we have, it says in press here, it actually just came out. I will put the link in the chat.
All right, thank you, Henry. Yeah, no, enjoy the presentation on food safety. I know we ourselves, our family, put up a lot of fish in the summer. Knowing now, I guess we're kind of picky too, but knowing what we like, do our own little quality control and able to kind of pick out what fishes not looks too good. And then even through our own processing, at the end of the day, we kind of look through and say, that one didn't turn out too good. But and again, that's just decades of knowledge and practice and trial and error. So thank you, Henry. I guess now we have a few minutes left. If there are any questions, let's see, I have something in there's the link there in the chat that Henry posted. But if we have any questions or any final thoughts from either Tikhon or Henry that you would like to share.
There's a question in the chat for Tikhon.
Oh,
let's put it into chat back. ANTHC, I think, still offers regional support. It was under the umbrella of ANTHC that we were doing that work. We shifted from a statewide model to having kind of smaller regional gatherings. And so last I'd heard, ANTHC still provides some funding to some different communities if there is a proposal put forward.
Well, I have a question for Tikhon then, if nobody else is jumping in, and that is, I was talking about the importance of sustaining traditional systems and learning and so on. Often the traditional way has been that people learn by doing and observing and so on. And I'm wondering, with the work you've done, have you seen ways that can be enhanced or supported by social media, by other methods, by modern techniques for helping people learn and helping share information?
Yeah, I think it always comes down to the intent of the training, right? And so like sometimes it can be a really useful tool, and other times there's concern about like how that information will be used or recreated by others. But I have seen some really powerful kind of open social media, like Facebook Live, opportunities to learn from. And so I think there's, through technology, this really kind of resurgence of sharing and identifying those who have received that knowledge and those teachings, because many of us have not, right? And so, I'm thinking specifically from my region, Jessica Denny has done an incredible amount of work to revitalize the tanning of moose hide, and sharing that knowledge that was passed down to her from her mother, and creating tanning workshops, and just how excited the community has been to receive that. And that momentum has been generated from social media.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions or comments from folks? Give you maybe a few seconds. Melinda.
Oh, you could go with Olivia first.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I saw your hand first, Olivia.
Thanks, Melinda. Hey, Henry, I have a question for you. Since you kind of work with this space with the veterinary scientists, do you know if they also, like vets across the Arctic, share information about some of the more food hazards across the Arctic with other vets? And if they also share information about how different communities process the food that can be shared with other communities?
A little bit. And that's a really great question, and I think more could probably be done. I know there have been a few cases where, again, somebody comes up, does some studies, and discovers, hey, we found this pathogen in this species, and nobody wants to hear that there are pathogens in their food, so that often the reaction is, oh my gosh, is that something we need to avoid? And not all the time. Sometimes, yes, the answer is yes, you do not want to be eating something that has harmful algal bloom toxins in it, at least at a certain level. On the other hand, there are many things where it's just not a major concern. But, I at least, if I hear some long Latin name of something that sounds scary, I'm going to react accordingly. And so learning how to communicate that is challenging. And that's not just a matter of the veterinary expertise, but also a question of public health and public health communication. And I don't think we have a terribly robust system for taking all of that information from different sources and figuring out how to deliver that message effectively. And so what you have left is, somebody, if I discover a pathogen, I don't want to keep it to myself. So I might, with good intention, let people know that it's there. But once that cat's out of the bag and people start reacting, we can wind up with counterproductive reactions. We certainly saw this in the case of environmental contaminants back in the 90s, when that became a big concern and people started avoiding traditional foods. And further research showed that yes, there are contaminants in traditional foods. There are also contaminants in every other food, and there's so many more nutrients and benefits from traditional foods that substituting a bunch of low quality, the sort of cheap and easy stuff Tikan was talking about from the store, is really a net loss for your health. So we need to think about how to do that, how to communicate those things in a more effective way.
Henry, I really liked your emphasis on that our traditional ways, have been a practice of food safety, and that blending of the Western methodologies with the traditional practices, I thought was really potent in your presentation, and I appreciated that emphasis.
Thanks. There's another question from Margaret in the chat about shifts in native plants and timing and things.
Yeah, I think the shifting of the climate is an important consideration. And at the Alaska Plants Food and Medicine Symposium, it was a topic of consistent focus and I think one of the themes was to what plant relatives do we want to invite? Because the plants are migrating, the climate is changing, and so thinking about are there specific species that we want to invite? Or are we just going to inherit the invasives that are coming with landscaping, right? And so looking to our lower 48 relatives and seeing, what plants have they been in relationship with that might now potentially be cultivated in Alaska is something to consider. When thinking about the food system, I emphasize the potential of export of some of the specialty crops But one of the biggest challenges, I think, system-wide that Alaska faces, that really became apparent in the Alaska Food Security and Independence Task Force, is the lack of climate-controlled storage, both cold and dry, in our hub communities. And so Mike Jones with ICER took that and really ran with it. And he ended up connecting with one of the Alaska Food Policy Council board members, Kyle Hill, who is the president of the AC stores in Alaska. And he shared the data of spoilage. And then they worked with the food bank to also get the spoilage rates, right? And so the bypass mail, the guaranteed air rate, is a big part of the distribution of our food across the state. And without that climate controlled storage in our hub communities, you can really only ship cold stuff in the winter and leafy greens in the summer. And so it's a huge pinch point on distribution of healthy foods that aren't shelf stable across the state. And it's also a barrier to market entry for any producer trying to access global or national markets. So for the state, it's a really big opportunity to see infrastructure investment to realize a much stronger and resilient food system for our community. No one asked, but I felt like I needed to plug that piece right there.
Great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent point, Tikan. We are 1 minute shy of noon, so if there's any really short last minute questions, going once, going twice. All right. And to answer the question there in the chat too for the greater group, yes, we'll be posting this recording most likely next week. So with that, I want to thank Tikan and Henry for both your time today and your presentation, and thank you. And thanks to everybody who attended.
Thanks for the opportunity and thanks for coming.
Thank you, Shan.